But as I've mentioned at the beginning, and I've been alluding to this whole time, all of these Makaitis, the Maritats included, they're all sort of walking around, jumping around, trying to avoid the elephant in the room, which is that there is some kind of mystery here in terms of the fact that it's not quite clear where halacha stands on this question. And as we saw, Rabbi Yosef quoted from Reb Shlomo Aisum ben Chasson, who also seemed to express this. Now, I found that in one of the journals, one of the recent publications that was touching on it, someone was mitzayin to Shalos Tshuvas Pa'as Sadcha Chele Gimel Siman Kuf Yutes, a contemporary Mechaber of Shmuel David monk, who actually goes out, as we say in slang, straight up, goes ahead and makes the case, the presentation, that there is no chiyuv. And I haven't seen anyone else be mitzayin to it, so I think it's a valuable haisafa here, even though he's not dealing with maritats and dealing with the parsha. But it's had the etzim inyan. We want to get to the bottom of this. So there's an actual tshuva in Pasadcha where he makes the opposite case. He says, Sheila, minik pasha b'chol makim, it's a minik animshich adayim yedayis harishayim, that all Yidden who live in a city or a number of villages in an area, if it can't be each one individually, so they all band together, soichrin maman alein chacham echad shu meishu v'kol adam v'ros iser v'heter, and to be melamed Torah barabim. And then this person gets treated differently than all other chachamim. He's in a totally different league. He's the Rav. Even if the other chacham are greater than him b'chachma, but they're not the official Rav, he's the official Rav. In what way? We see that he or his shliach gets the darshan set times, Shabbos HaGadol, Shabbos Shuvah, all the things that we know about a Rav, right? We take it for granted. Yeah, of course, in Yiddishkeit there's a Rav, right? So is that the case though? But let's first finish his thought. When he darshans, no one else can darshan. And usually he's the one who's shofet, but not like the and he gets the most chashuv place in the shul. And the Ashkenazim call this a Rav, and the Sfaradim call it a Chacham. So he says, Tzarech biur, b'meh koichoy shel Chacham ze gadol, ad shekol b'nei yirei mechabdin oisek meir rabam, afilu elish le'landu himanu klum ma'at. Where does this come from? Sagt the Pa'asad, sagt the monk, minig zeh, af bishu pashel b'chol mekayim, zahar b'deirus, so b'chol mak muzman hayudum lanu nogaken. Even though it seems to have always been this way, Mikol makim einay nisker b'shulchan aruch lahedya loy b'teiras chayva v'loy b'teiras minig shel mitzvah and minig shel rishos. It never actually says anywhere that there is a concept of a Rav and that there's an inyan to hire a Rav and that the Rav has this status that he's the Rav. It doesn't say it anywhere. It's a shocking fact, but it's a fact. It does seem to be alluded to in passing, but it's never stated straight out. Maybe it was a minute plashet b'yaiser, so it never occurred to them to mention it, and that's why the Bali Shulchan Aruch, or Malaki from the Postscript, never mention it. He says the Ravid, interestingly, the Ravid in the Seder Kabbalah, the Ravid Bal Seder Kabbalah writes, but when he says that, he still means Rabbane Kol Yisrael, leaders of Yidden, just like the Goyim were leaders. But the Ashkenazim are calling the local Rav the Rav, and it's not clear where this comes from. Zokter of Monk, perhaps the solution lies in the word Rav. What does Rav actually mean? Rav isn't necessarily a Torah thing or a rabbinic thing. Rabbinic is also nigzer from the title Rav, but it doesn't mean a chacham in Torah. Rav means a sar. So could be pshat is that the Rav's power is derived from the fact that he's accepted as a sar, surarusa damasa. Now, the leader of the kehillah ought to be a gavra rabba. However, even if you accept someone who's not a gavra rabba, it's also it works. He's the reisha ear. And so you have to go back, whenever it says Rav, Rabbanos in these earlier Makaitis, it doesn't necessarily mean Rav in the sense that he's the Rav of the shul. Saying someone is the Rav of the shul, according to this, doesn't really make sense. It's like a nonsensical statement. Rav and Rabbanos means person with control. And sometimes that person could be appointed, and sometimes a person can make himself the boss. So the translation of Rav is really the boss. Someone who's machzik b'Rabbanos has a din Rav. That's mentioned here today, based on the Rivash. And so there it says that even if there's a Chacham Gadol and a Rav, but the Saras HaRav is a Sarara. And no one can start up with the Rav, because the Rav is the Rav. The Rav is the boss. And even if that Rav is not a Gavra Rav, the Rav is still a Rav. But ideally, it's a mitzvah that those who appoint him should appoint the Talmid Chacham Hayidei Lahashiv B'chol Makom B'Torah. And he's made a bit, and then he says, so if he's there, that's the Sirarusa Damas that's mentioned in Talmud. So Bazoi, then the minig has taka shirish even in the Talmud. And then Bazoi, the Rambam says that any minig mentioned in the Talmud, koifen b'chol makom, so you could be koifet to impose what the Gemara is talking about. And he says, if you look in the Ramah Yeriderish Memhei Sif Chav Beis, where it talks about there's a Rav and another Chacham comes and he wants to also fears like a Chacham. So the Ramah says two things. If it's a Srara Shal Kavod without taking money away from the Rav, like Chobah B'Kedushin, certain things the Rav gets an income from. So if you just want the Srara Shal Kavod without taking away money, that's okay. But you also can't paskin and darshan in the place of the Rav. So what exactly? What are the rules here? What's okay? What's not okay? Zok the Rav Monk. That really it depends on what the Bnei Yair were makabel. But the standard in the time of the Ramah was that based on the Gemara that you have a Sar, you have a Rav. Now the shaila is, what does that mean? So Lagabe, the Hayrus Alidrish, so that had already become synonymous with the title of Sar and Rav. So if you come and you're also darshan, you're also paskening, so then that's sort of undermining this Rav and Sar. Whereas with regard to other stuff, so then it depends. If there's Hafsid Mammon, so then they're makbin. If there's no Hafsid Mammon, you just want to have your own chashivas, you have your own fiefdom, so then that's not a stira to the Sar and the Rav. So that's his way of sort of sorting out what the Ramah is saying. But really, fundamentally, maybe even some of these details are somewhat arbitrary, or it's kafima shekiblu b'nei ha'ir. He says, now we can be mezalz in the minig, the Ramakbid, the Deiris Rabim, Kremis Harbe, even though the minig is not mentioned clearly in Shulchan Aruch, and the reason why it's not mentioned is also not clear. And a bit further here, he actually gets to this question of kaifin. He says, in Shut Zakan Aaron, the first one of Leo Halevi, Nagdoilim Shibadoidim of the Re'im, and Mani Beirav, Simon Kuf Megimel, he writes that Minu Rav, Amanas Lamas B'nei Yer Torah, is a Kalva Chaymer from Kaifin B'nei Yer, Zel, live this basic Knesses. Back to this kaifin question. So they keep on trying to bring rayas that it's Kalva Chaymer from this, Kalva Chaymer from that. Zogt the Pa'asadcha, L'chayra can bring a raya for Kert. Kaifin B'nei Yer, it says, Lichtav Torah Navim Miksuvim. Mashma that when it comes to Torah, the only thing you force them is to get Torah Navim Miksuvim, but not to hire a Chacham to teach them how to read it. Dr. Pasadcha, Lafis for us, it was Menzagen that originally the assumption was one of Chazal was that everyone knows how to read Tanakh, this Malamdim, and other Sfarim they didn't have, so you didn't have to hire anyone to read or interpret Sfarim that didn't exist. But now, in today's reality, now you would need a Rav. But Alpha Bikain is still Shiver, even if they didn't have other Sfarim. So Adrab, Kava Chaymer, you need to hire a Chacham to teach you Torah Shabbal Peh. So why did it never mention it in Yanim of Bnei Yer Kaifin Alim Zeh? Why is this missing? It never says you're Kaifa to get a Chacham to teach you Torah Shabbal Peh. But Doichi, you can say it's so pashut that it wasn't mentioned. Yeser Nira, that Bezmana, they Taka didn't take money for this, which is a whole other point, whole other dimension that Taka needed to get mentioned somewhere, so I guess we'll mention it here. That Be'at, it wasn't something you took money for. It was Chacham, every Chacham supported himself, and we know the Rambam versus the Gaon in that whole parsha. So Mamela, Kaifin is about things that involve money. And that is the assumption in all these Achrayim, that money is involved. But really, up until a certain point, there was no money involved, so it couldn't be on the list of things that you're Kaifet to spend money on. And he says the clearest place you see this in Shulchan Aruch is Taka in Siman and Gimel from the Rosh in Yad Bnei Yair Masagas K'dei L'skor Rav Shleich Tzibur Mikaydin Lemi, and he's Mitzayin to the famous Bir Halacha, and also here today Siman Rishon Aleph. This din is cited there as well. And this minig of hiring a Rav is also mentioned that Agav Yer Deya Siman Rishon Hey Sif Chav Beis Taka the Ramah that we were just talking about. And Hilchot Staka Yer Deya Siman Rishon Aleph Sif Yud Gimel She'en Lafarnes Rav Shebeir Mekis Shel Staka the Gnai Huloi, which also ties into what we were talking about before, the Mari Tats to spend Staka money on paying the Rav. So here we see that it's a Gnai, and side for him and side for the Bnei Yair, you have to have a separate source of funding. And he is mitzayin now to the Gemara. It says that a sheikh has to show his knife to a chacham, so that implies there is a chacham. I'm not going to get into all the rayas back and forth. And then he concludes and says, "Mashakasav shutchsam sefer erachayim yud gimel." That bizman hazeh harav oisik b'tzorchi tzibur. So it was muchach that Amal was not azoi. So nearly in his deity that Amal they were machalik between srarusa demasa and tzorchi tzibur, and srara between that and srara b'tzorchi adim. The Rav was memuna on the be'adam l'chavir dinim aminis and isiv hater, and the other tzorchi tzibur was a different job, like the distinction between a rish galusa and a goyin, or bizman shal yisrael shrino admasam. You have a melech versus a kohen gadol. This idea of splitting the responsibility, splitting the power. And then Bismana Achren, Ulu B'pnei Chisar and Kiss, the Tzarchet Tzibur was also the Rav's responsibility. And the Ba'as Adcha, is at least consciously acknowledging this issue, and he's trying to make his way through the maze, but he's acknowledging that it's actually, if you actually just think about it objectively without trying to force the point that you have to hire a Rav, it actually is kind of confusing and unclear, and the lines are blurry, and the job description is very blurry, and this is the closest I've seen someone come to acknowledging all of this. So as I was preparing this, after I went through these Makaitis, I hadn't gone through the Pa'as Sadcha in its entirety, and I see that some of what I want to say overlaps with what he said. But I sort of sketched out some of my thoughts on this topic, and I'll share my thoughts on this topic, and with that we'll conclude. Having been Isaac a little bit in these inyanim, in these sugyas, in the Kailal, we're Isaac a little bit in Yerdei, Hilchos Kved Rabbi, Kved Talmid Chacham, and other shiurim as well. So, first of all, it's important to clarify that Amal, Inyan of Hira, Paskening, was linked to the institution of yeshivas. You know, the yeshivas in the Zman HaAmiroim, the Zman HaGoinim, Paskening was associated with the yeshivas. And the Mele would seem like it existed, it was operating separately in parallel to the communal entities, the organs of power within the Kol, within the Tzibur. And when we speak about the chiyuv of not paskening, if there's someone greater who can pasken than you, all of that is framed within the context of yeshiva, that you have a rebbe in your yeshiva and he taught you Hira, so you can't pasken befanov because he's your rebbe. But if someone else lives there and did not learn in this yeshiva, so none of those chiyuvim apply to him. So it's always framed as talmidim to the rebbe, not tzibur towards the manig ruchni of the tzibur. Now, there's a related point, which is that today, one of the terms that's often used in this context is Marad Asra. However, if you ever dug into the topic of Marad Asra, you would see, and there's a Hebrew Wikipedia article on it, and different articles on it, that even though in Chazal you do see this musig of the Mekayim Shel Rabbi Eliezer, they did this, Mekayim Shel Rabbi Yossi Aglili, they followed his psak, or later the Amiroim, Asrei de Rav, Asrei de Shmuel. But this concept is also not mentioned in the major Sifrei Halacha, like the Rambam, like the Torah, and the musik of Amar Da'asra is, close to the modern sense, is first mentioned in the Rashba. And even there, the Rashba is not talking about Amar Da'asra in the common sense today, but rather in the notion, what was then the modern notion, that certain Kehilas followed the Rambam Sefer, and certain Kehilas followed others for the Rif Sefer. So there were these Paiskim that had issued Svarim that have a body of text, a body of psak, and then there was this musik of minig, which was also very powerful back then. So each community had its minig, and their minig was that we follow the psak of the Rambam. So this was a new concept, sort of a new combination, and the Rashba acknowledges that and says, okay, that taka has power, so this community taka follows this psak, and in that sense, that paisik is sort of the Mara de Asra. So that would also mean that the Rashba is still not the first source for the concept of Mara de Asra in the modern sense. Oh, there's local Rav, and he used the Rav, the Paisik of Mara de Asra. And in another share that I once gave in Kailal, I mentioned that actually those who have researched early Ashkenaz have found that in Ashkenaz there actually was still no such Moisad of Rabbanas. There was no Moisad of Rabbanas, and there was not even a Moisad of a Beis Din Kavua. To the extent that a community had a Rav, it was a Rosh Yeshiva. A Chacham would move to town and establish a yeshiva, and he was Taka Chacham and Meirah, and his Talmidim learned from him, and the Mamish, you could see the model of Chazal played out in reality in Ashkenaz. There was no such thing as a Rav and a Marad Asra. Akdekach, there wasn't even a Beis Din either, which L'chayr Fi Chazal, there should be a Beis Din. There was no Beis Din Kavua either, and the Rosh Yeshiva was not seen as the Reish Beis Din. And whenever someone needed a Beis Din, they had to schlep together 3 people, Zebar Le'echad, and that's its own whole shir, its own whole parsha. It's only later in Poland that the Ramah writes, and here in Poland, writes in Shulchan Aruch, here we have a Beis Din Kavua, so you have to follow their authority. So it almost seems like, and this is similar to what the Rav Monk was saying, that within the tzibur, there's a concept of a parnas tzibur, there's a concept of the leaders of the tzibur, and they have very strong power, and that was what I was talking about earlier. So it seems like these are really 2 separate things. A Rav Meirah is that of a yeshiva, which is not a tzibur institution, and then there's a parnas tzibur. And then it seems that at some point, these 2 institutions got crossed with each other. That the Rav now has the toikef of a parnas tzibur. So the parnas who has the toikef to run the tzibur and the Rav, who has the Toikif to Paskin for his Talmidim, sort of got merged together, and now he's the Rav Parnas Rosh Yeshiva of this tzibur. But still, as Rabbi Monk says as well, still not super clear how exactly that works, because not every Rav is necessarily so chashiv and doesn't necessarily have so many Talmidim, and there could be other people and other Talmidim. So this is the question, this is the problem, this is what needs to be ironed out. And we also need to distinguish between a Rav and a Beis Din, which sometimes seem more synonymous and sometimes less, but in Chazal, the idea of appointing a Beis Din is pretty clear, and open Chesed Mishpat right in the beginning, that's pretty clear, but a Beis Din and a Rav seem to be themselves two separate things. But in this discussion of appointments, you have to also talk about Beis Din is also a factor which we haven't focused on as much. In light of all this, it would be interesting to go back and review what the Rebbe actually says. The Rebbe mentioned the Morad Asra a lot, and in many cases seemed to elevate the power of the Morad Asra, although I would always argue that it shouldn't be taken completely in a one-sided way, and often the Rebbe wanted people that have a certain influence to use their influence for good. That doesn't mean that the Rebbe is giving them ultimate kayach to do whatever they want, whenever they want. That often does not seem to be the case. And it's more of like a balance of powers. That's my interpretation of many of the Rebbe's sichas and minus, and the system that he instituted of different sources of power seems to indicate that there's more of a balance of power, and each one has taka, chashuv power and strong power, but that's a whole other discussion as well. This can also be tied into the whole question of rabbis versus rabbanim. And recently I recorded a whole arichos about what's the first rabbis, what was the framework that they existed in, the framework of a magid, the framework of a rav, what were the existing frameworks at the time. But then at some point they sort of turned into their own framework, and they often have more power than rabbanim. So the Kenzog, and that really there is no musik of a rav, and there isn't really a musik of a rabbi either. There's a musik of a parnas hatzibur, and B'taka saw the language of parnas by Moshe Rabbeinu Taka and Yeshua and Maritatz. It's interesting that you do notice there that there's the word parnas seems to get mentioned a lot in those types of contexts, because that was Taka Moshe's power and Yeshua's power, that the Taka were more than just a rav and a posek. They were the parnas. They were the leader in all respects. And as Rabbi Monk says, sometimes you can have separation of powers, you can split the powers in different ways. So it seems that at some point the Rabbanim had a parnas-like position, parnas-like power that got crossed with their power of Torah. But then at some point their power waned in many cases, and the Rebbes received a certain power of parnas over a certain area. But it needs to sort of fit within that framework, so that would be the framework. And the Mice, it seems that in many places, we've sort of returned to this ancient matzav where the Rav Taka doesn't have any such power of a parnas, or no one has the power of a parnas, depending on where you live. But either the power doesn't exist at all, or the Rav doesn't have it. And often I've diagnosed, I've identified there are many cases where there's sort of this confusion between the Metzias. The reality is that the Rav Pliny does not have power. But because people think and understand from Shulchan Aruch, from here, from there, that the Rav ought to have power, so there's this clash between the power in theory and the power in reality. I always say that the power that the Rav has doesn't come from Shulchan Aruch, doesn't come from Sfarim, it comes from the reality. Whatever power he has. Whatever he knows he can get away with doing, he does. Whatever he can't get away with doing, he doesn't do. And every Rav's power is different than the next one's. And this Rav can pull off this, but he can't pull off that. The other one can pull off that, but he can't pull off this. So that's really the reality. And so this pre-existing notion of mine sort of fits with what we're saying here, that really in halacha there is no clear hagdara, there really is no clear framework. It's the power that he's able to give himself, whether by being appointed, or as we saw Shulchan Aruch mentioned that sometimes a Rav can appoint himself. If a Rav starts a community and people join his community, he's probably the ultimate boss. He probably has tremendous power. People join a Rebbe community, that Rebbe has tremendous power. But even then, different Rebbes have different degrees of power. And there are things that the Rebbes themselves will say, if I try to do it, I would fail. I know I wouldn't be Matzliach. So that's when you know whether you have the power or not, whatever you can get away with. That's ultimately lahavdil here in America as well. There's all the stuff in theory, constitutional powers, but ultimately the power that you have is the power that you can actually get away with. If you tried pressing the buttons and you succeed, then you have the power. If you press the buttons and you don't succeed, you don't have that power, which is seems like something people struggle to understand. And perhaps more recent events have proven that more reality-based notion of power versus theoretical. So Bazoy Lafi calls that back to the fundamental question. There's no chiyuv, there's no kaifin, because there's taka no chiyuv to appoint a rav with the taikif of a parnas. And as amongst there's also no chiyuv really to pay either. The Chacham were supposed to set themselves up and set up their own sources of funding and be Meireh and be Marbitz Torah, and that was that. That's the ultimate original concept in the context in Gemara. Again, obviously you have to go back to Bayis Sheni, that you start talking about the Nasi and the Av Beis, and you'd have to analyze the exact framework of power there as well. We're not talking about that. That was like a national thing, or the Reish Galusa in Bavel. We're talking about more like individual communities. Although Hagufa, you could say that individual communities, what they do or don't have may also depend on whether they consider themselves to be under the larger umbrella of something like the Nasi are based in the Reish Galusa, and that could also be the case today with the world of Rebbes and having Rebbe leaders, where if you consider yourself to be under the title of Rebbe, and it's interesting how much the Fidik Rebbe and the Rebbe sort of linked the notion of a Rebbe to the concept of a Nasi, and I've always understood it to not just be a word in the Valtanaim, but sort of alluding to these ancient frameworks of power and leadership, and that a Rebbe sees themselves as a Nasi. Now, we know that the Reish Galusa itself was fractured in the, I don't know, from the, let's say the 800s and on, 900s, and the next few hundred years, there were multiple Reish Galusas. There was a little bit, I've said before, it's a little bit like a Rebbe Haif. There was a Reish Galusa of Baghdad, and there's a Reish Galusa of other cities in Iraq. And you had also the Nogid, the Nogid in Mitzrayim, the Nogid in Spain. So you see these different notions, these different frameworks of power, and it's not just fun trivia. You really have to sit and analyze what these models are and what they have in common and how they're different. So perhaps being under a larger nugget, a parnas, that sort of satisfies you need to have a leader. And then whether or not you have a chacham or what exactly the chacham's setup is may not be as important, but it does seem like fundamentally there is no chiyuv to appoint certainly a local rav with a taikif of a parnas, although as the Abiyah Eimer tained, Rabbi Yosef and others, in some cases you could make the case that there is such a pirza that the only way to solve the pirza would be to appoint a rav and give him the power of a parnas. We need to create the position and give that position powers in order to address a certain problem. That may be the case, but that's not as a rule. And Rabbi Yosef also seemed to acknowledge and indicate that it's not really as a rule, but he was arguing that in this particular case, Yerushalayim desperately needed people in this position. So there's no chiyuv really to appoint a rav with the power of a parnas. On the other hand, you need to have a chacham to be meireh, but there doesn't seem to, there's no need for there to be any particular framework for that. So if there is no chacham in reality, so then there should be some chacham, some chiyuv, maybe even kaifin. Maybe you have to spend money if you need to have someone to paskin in some context, in some framework. It's hard to imagine that if there's no one there, then that would be okay, even though it's not clearly addressed and specified in halachic mekayros. But perhaps that was what the Rosh was trying to express. That Lamaisa, if you don't have one, then you have to spend money on it. But until then, it had never been stated in halach. Apparently, the Rosh is being cited as the first marker that says you have to spend money to get it off. So same as a shliach tzibur. Shliach tzibur was not something. No one had the assumption that you need to pay and import and hire shliach tzibur. Hopefully you have someone locally who knows how to daven. What if you don't have anyone locally who knows how to daven? Then what are you going to do? You obviously sort of need a shliach tzibur, or else your tefillas can't function. And then how and which way are you a Jewish community? So it doesn't say in Gemara, it doesn't say you need to hire a shliach tzibur. But if you don't have one, then you kind of need to hire one. So the Rosh is expressing the same thing about a chacham. If you don't have one, then presumably, I guess you have to hire one, and that has a din kadima. But this is very important, very helpful to approaching this with the right framework. That it seems like there's a case to be made that hiring a rav in the common sense, or in the common notion that the rav is hired to paskin and has power and to differing degrees, as Rabbi Monk mentioned. In some cases, it seems like they also rounded tzarchid tzibur. In some cases, it seems like they didn't. We know historically certain rabbanim sound like they were very powerful, and certain rabbanim sound like they were not very powerful. Like I said, it really just is up to their local reality, and you can't really quote Sfarim to prove anything, in my opinion. So I think this helps flesh out that point, and as we see, that there isn't even a clear musig of a Marad Asra, a clear musig of hiring a Rav, hiring a Chacham. On the other hand, you need to have someone to paskin for you. And so this is, even though this is already over 2 hours in, but this is almost, you could say, maybe a preliminary attempt to take a jab at this. Clearly, this is a very confusing and unclear tchum, and yet it's so important and touches on such important yesodis of Yiddishkeit. And as Rav Menashe Klein mentioned, it comes to the Yeshiva Shavelt, where they downplay Heira and they downplay Rabbanos. So it's taka shver to taka understand exactly how their shita is justified, and taka the Mishnah Brura. I mean, speaking about that, the Yeshiva Shavelt considers itself a hemshech of the Mishnah Brura. I think it's very clear, very pasha to say that this direction the Yeshiva Shavelt took is completely at odds. Hepech das HaChavetz Chaim Mishnah Brura. The Chavetz Chaim Mishnah Brura took a chrayas for Klal Yisrael, and I think it's pretty clear that he would have wanted all the Bachrim in Yeshiva to go and take achrayas and go to places with very shvach Yiddishkeit, and by his day there were communities with very shvach Yiddishkeit. There always were places, any place that didn't have a Rav in the Yeshiva for a while tended to be very shvach, doesn't matter when. And obviously there are many modern Orthodox communities today, out-of-town communities, which don't have a yeshiva in the sense of a yeshiva that produces Talmid Chacham B'nai Torah. So even having a Rav without a yeshiva is also doesn't really complete the picture. And traditionally, a Rav was seen also as a Marbetz Torah and a Ma'amad yeshiva, not just giving shiurim to Balabatim. So really, Yiddishkeit generally and then locally can't exist without this, and the Mishnah Brura, the Chavetz Chaim was aware of this, and there are stories about how someone just reminded me again, it's been going around lately, that the Chavetz Chaim announced that the Bachrim should go to communities to be ma'ir about Mikvayis and Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and then some Bachrim came over to the Chavetz Chaim to talk about a Taisvis, and at some point the Chavetz Chaim said, and why are you here? Why didn't you go away like I said? And the Bachrim says, I don't want to. And the Chavetz Chaim said something sharp of art, like, your whole Taisvis is not worth anything. So the Velt, like the Menashe Klein said, you have shuls that claim to follow the Mishnah Brura. You have the whole Yeshiva Shavelt claims to follow the Mishnah Brura, but the Mishnah Brura, I think it's a davar pashut historically. I think any objective historian would be masking that if the Chavetz Chaim saw the state of Elmai Yeshivas today, where it's even worse. Back then, the Talmidei Yeshivas still had the notion of becoming a Rav somewhere, and again, a lot of those communities were not so great. Don't delude yourselves. Some of them had more Torah, and some of them had less, and the Rav should see it as a challenge to be Meifetz Torah, to be Marbetz Torah, to create a yeshiva, to educate the youth there to become Talmidei Chacham B'nai Torah. If the Chavetz Chaim would see today where the direction the Yeshiva Shavelt went, and now it could be the Yeshiva Shavelt has terutzim that they came to America, they had to build Torah from scratch, terutzim ahina, but I think the Chavetz Chaim would be very upset by this. And the fact that Chabad has this model of you learn in yeshiva, you go out to do shluchas, so even though a certain percentage of the shluchim are not quite Moedei Hira per se, and all that, their title, and this fits into what we said before. There is no real title of Rav. It could be more Parnas like, less Parnas like, more Rav Moedei Hira like, less Rav Moedei Hira like, more Marbetz Torah, less Marbetz Torah. There is no one model, so that's the same for shluchim, and most of them are not Moedei Hira per se, but they are being Meifetz Torah in some way. That's a lot closer to what the Chavetz Chaim was demanding, and a lot closer to the traditional Jewish model that someone who is a Ben Torah, a Chacham, should go and serve as a Chacham somewhere. So I think sometimes Chabad itself is done a disservice by using terms like shlichus. Shlichus just refers to the fact that the reason why you're inspired to do this is out to the Rebbe shlichus, and that itself has tremendous mileage, that you're connecting yourself to the Rebbe and you're doing it because the Rebbe said. But to come and identify and say, I'm here as a shliach, I think can sometimes obscure and obfuscate the purpose of what a person is doing there. So interestingly, Bafram Korf just passed away, and I was looking up some of the early reporting on his presence there, and I saw that when he first arrived there, it said he was the regional director of Merkis, the regional Merkis office, and then he opened the shul, and then he opened the Chabad house, So those are really three different things. And being a shliach can mean a million things itself. So calling people shluchim first and foremost can sometimes, I think, take away from their other milas or the other things they could be doing. A person is a rav, a person is a rosh hashiva, a person is a moed hira. There are many things. A person is a regional director of the Merkos office. These are all things that are under the rubric of shlichus. But shlichus just refers to your sort of relationship with the Rebbe and your inspiration to do what you do. But the fact that the local Chabad person is called the shliach, and the fact that his institution is called the Chabad house, I think sometimes is geireya from what it could be and from what the person could be presenting themselves as doing. But that's really another discussion. But it's sort of tied into what I was saying. So I mentioned it, B'derech Hagav. And back to the Yeshiva Shavelt. So the Yeshiva Shavelt is much further from what the Mishnah Berurah is saying here, and the Chabad world is much closer to what the Mishnah Berurah is saying here. Obviously, there is more nuance to the Yeshiva Shavelt and its attitude towards Hira, which Menashe kind of alluded to, that they're mezalzel in it. Obviously, they still have Moed Hira, and they still hold the psak, and following psak lahalacha is still very important to them. But it's interesting. It's an interesting internal dynamic as to how that balances out the lamdonos, the lamdos, the Rosh Yeshiva versus the Moed Hira, and what exactly the attitude is. Also in Eretz Yisrael, it sort of depends on which community you're in. I guess maybe in the Chazanish community, I'm guessing they're closer maybe in spirit to striving to be a Moed Hira, although not an official Moed Hira with a shtela, but more halacha-like, I think, in the focus, but that's beyond our purview to delve into that analysis, and I'm sure there are greater experts on that. In conclusion, I'll mention that one application of the shaila of whether you need a rav for every kehillah is bungalow colonies. I saw that Yisrael David Harpenes of Williamsburg has a sefer Kovitz halachis l'mo'enes hakayetz, so he sort of is malakid halachis with through the lens of bungalow colonies. And the edition I saw in Eitzer Chochmas from Tafshin Pei Beis, page 21. So he's mitzayin. When you go to the country, you go to a bungalow colony, you need to be in a place that has a Marera, or at least close nearby. And he's mitzayin to much of Makaidas, including to the Maritats. Then he mentions, there are those who pointed out, well, today you have a telephone, you have a car, so you mamash need to have one mamash at hand. And he responds to that and says, well, if you go with the Rambam, you go with some of these Makaidas, it sounds like you need it in principle. Push it in principle, you need to have one. But like I said, he's pointing out this taina, which also can apply to the city as well. But the Lefi Shitosoi Erhal, that every bungalow colony, which is also its own sort of community and kehillah, and Adrabah, bungalow colonies tend to have, in a way I've observed before, bungalow colonies tend to be closer to the classic concept of a kehillah. There is more of like a reisha call and a vada call, and there are decisions that have to be made on behalf of the entire community in terms of spending and taxes and stuff like that. So interestingly, the bungalow colony model is actually closer in a way to the classic kehillah. And yet it seems like even in the Chassidus Shavelt, where a shul in Brooklyn might have a rav or a leader, but a bungalow colony, Lav Dafka has a rav and a leader. So it's an interesting observation of Rav Harpenes, and he's tining that you need one, and not just to paskin, but to give shiurim. All the inyanim that a rav has, they all apply to bungalow colony in one way or another. You need someone to be marbet Torah, you need someone to be oimed beperetz. So these could all be applied individually in addition to the city. They could be applied directly to the model of the bungalow colonies, which is an interesting point. And as I also just mentioned about the shluchim, you can not all shluchim consider themselves Moed Hira. So then there's a shaila: if you hold that every community needs a Moed Hira, and the shliach himself is not really filling that role, so then right, that shaila. On the other hand, they obviously have their Moed Hira that they reach out to, and they're able to be a channel for those rabbanim. So it's interesting to take this question and apply it to all these different contexts, whether it's shuls in Brooklyn, whether it's bungalow colonies in the country, or whether it's shluchim on shluchas. There's a lot to discuss, a lot to unpack, and we've gone way over time here, longer than we've ever gone before, but it's a very yesodistic, wichtige issue, and there's such confusion, such lack of clarity, and very little discussion as to the underlying lack of clarity, and I hope we took a stab at pointing that out and clearing it up just a little bit.